Can't hear me? No, okay, now. Again, hi, and first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. My name is Manuel Matuzovic, and I'm a freelance front-end developer from Vienna. The slides are already online, so you can check them out and follow along on your laptop if you want to. Right. On my way to Budapest, I was working on some JavaScript stuff, or, actually I wasn't working, I was doing it just for fun, because I like to spend some of my free time doing web stuff. Who else does that? Who spends free time doing web stuff? Yeah, some of us. Because we all love our job, or at least I do, and I still love it even though I'm doing this for quite a while now. I made my first website about 17 years ago. Some friends and I were playing an online game, and we had a so-called clan, and I made the website for this clan. And that's the site. The name is in French. And the translation is "Eat Your Poo." We were some badass 13-year-olds, yeah, definitely. But our website was pretty cool. We had some image buttons, and of course a guest book and some polls. I informed users that the site was optimized for a certain resolution, and of course I had a marquee tag here. Yeah. And there was even some custom JavaScript stuff going on. A few years later, I made my first personal website. There's a lot of embarrassing stuff going on. I'm not going to go into detail here. I even cut some stuff out because it was just too much. There are two very interesting things here. The first one is one of my favorite movies was The Shining. And the second thing is that I didn't use CSS at all in this website. I made the layout with so-called frame sets. Some of you may know them. Yeah, frame sets. And I defined 3 columns using HTML attributes, and then I embedded in each of those columns a separate HTML file. One for the navigation, one for the main content, and one for the sidebar. For the layout of the main content, of course, I used tables and attributes like border color, background color, align, and I set the width to 442%. It worked. And for the global styles, of course, I used again HTML attributes like background color, v-link, and a-link for active and visited links. And the good old font tag for font size and font family. I didn't use CSS because maybe I didn't know about it, or maybe I just didn't need it. But a few years later in college, I learned CSS and all the great properties like float, position, overflow, background properties, line height, and so on. That was amazing. And then a few years later again, I was introduced to a game changer, to CSS3, because all of a sudden we had border radius, box shadow, animation, transforms, web fonts, of course. And the way the web looked like changed significantly. And it still keeps changing because browsers are constantly shipping great new features like flexbox, grids, feature queries, custom properties, amazing stuff to create amazing experiences. But you know what Spider-Man's uncle said? With great power comes great responsibility. And now we also have many tools to create bad experiences. And that's what I want to talk about. In the course of the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you some properties that you can use in order to improve the accessibility and the user experience of your sites, and some properties that you can misuse and change the experience for the worse. And I'm going to start with font size. The font size for text was, in the last few years, somewhere between 14 and 18 pixels. That has changed recently, and we can see more and more sites increasing their font sizes. For example, on CSS Tricks and Medium, we have a font size of 21 pixels. And that's a good thing, because 16 pixels for text is definitely not good enough, or not big enough. Of course, it depends on the font you're using, but starting somewhere between 18 and 20 pixels is probably a good thing, and then working your way up from there. Because usually, the bigger the screen size, the bigger the distance between the user and the screen. So for the usage on a smart TV, for example, you would want to have a really big font size so people can still read the text from a far distance. Next thing, line height. The line height in most browsers is at roughly 1.2 by default. The Web Accessibility Initiative recommends a line height of at least 1.5 because for people with cognitive disabilities, it's easier to start a new line after they have finished the previous one if the line height is bigger. And on top of that, if you compare the two, the second one looks even nicer because of the bigger line height. Yeah. Text is by default aligned to the left or to the right, depending on the direction of the language. And a thing designers like to do is to justify the text, because justifying text makes especially long text look nicer, because all lines have the same length. What the browser does in order to get those same length lines is that it increases the word spacing. And this may result in irregular word spacing. And for some people, it's harder to read text if the word spacing is irregular. And on top of that, a friend of mine recently told me that using justified text in web design is so 2016, so it's bad for accessibility and it's not cool, so just don't do it. Please. Dennis told me to say please. Here we have a nice paragraph. The line height is all right, the font size is all right, but something is odd about this paragraph. It's just too narrow. Not enough words fit per line. It's hard to read. On the other hand, in this paragraph, the text is just too long. The paragraph is too wide. What's considered ideal is a character count between 45 and 75 characters per line. So that's considered ideal. Yes. So here, for example, we have a paragraph with a maximum of about 65 characters per line. It looks nice and it's easy to read. What's cool about that is that we can use CSS to control that. We can set the max width of this paragraph to 65 characters. The character unit has been around for quite a while now, and it's pretty cool. It represents the width of the glyph 0 in the Elements font. And this paragraph, for example, here, will only be as big as to fit 65 characters, roughly 65 characters per line. So that's pretty cool. We have, or there are several pseudo elements we can use in CSS to create cool things. Two of the more popular ones are before and after. You can use before to add content directly after the start tag, and after to add content directly before the end tag. We can do cool stuff using those pseudo elements, but there is one thing we shouldn't do. We should not add text using CSS. Text belongs in an HTML file coming from a database or API, but it shouldn't be in CSS. What we can do is we can add icons or glyphs using CSS, for example. Here, this code will produce this nice looking X. And I've used this X here to create a custom list. I've removed the default list styling, and I've added spans in each list item with this X. And if the sound works, we are going to hear how the screen reader JAWS on Windows is going to read this list. Okay, doesn't matter. It will say times item 1, times item 2, times item 3, times item 4. Because as it turns out, this X isn't the X, but the symbol for times, like in 2 times 2 or 3 times 4. And this can get very confusing because users might think that we are multiplying all those list items. But in reality, we're just using it as a design feature, as a bullet. So what you want to do here is you want to make sure that you hide those things semantically. This means that it's still visually visible, but hidden for screen readers. And you can do that by using the area hidden attribute and setting it to true. And by the way, in this example, don't do that what I just showed you. You would rather stick to the good old list style type or list style image for changing these icons. Is more accessible. Now, a nice topic for today. Color contrast. Color contrast is important. because of conferences and because 285 million people are visually impaired, 39 million are blind, and 246 have low vision. 7 to 12% of men and less than 1% of women have some form of color vision deficiency. It's usually hard for them to differentiate two colors like red and green. Another reason why color contrast is important is that people dim their screens on their smartphones, for example, and people like to use their smartphones outside even when the sun is shining. So we know color contrast is important, but how much is enough? The Web Accessibility Initiative defines it by enough contrast between text and its background so that it can be read by people with moderately low vision. Okay, we get that, but we need a number. We need a way to measure that, and there is one, the so-called contrast ratio. The lowest ratio is 1:1. You get that if you use the same color for text and background. The highest ratio is 1:21. You get that if you use black text on white background and vice versa. The minimum ratio for normal text we would like to achieve, for normal text that is less than 25 pixels, is 4.5:1. And the minimum ratio for bold text that is less than 19 pixels is 3:1. And for larger text, it's also 3:1. That's the absolute minimum. Ideally, we would have a ratio of 7:1 for normal text and 4.5:1 for bold text. Of course, there are ways to measure the ratio. For example, there's one in the browser made by Leroux. You can enter here on the left side the background color and on the right side the text color, and it will give you the score. For example, here we have a ratio of 3.2:1, which is not enough. But you can change that and try some other colors, and the score will update. And here, for example, we have a score of 15.3:1, which is very good. Another way of testing accessibility is possible with DevTools in Chrome. Starting with Chrome 60, Lighthouse is baked in Chrome DevTools in the audits panel, and you can check your sites for several best practices, for PWA best practices, accessibility, performance, and general best practices. Lighthouse will check your sites and give you a score. And it will list all the things that aren't all right. And for example, here it will tell you which elements don't have enough contrast. So that's pretty nice. Another great thing is that you can display the color ratio directly in the color picker in Chrome DevTools. That's not possible in standard Chrome. You have to get Chrome Canary, enable experiments, and you have to press Shift 7 times, and then you really have to do that. And then you have to check the setting, and that's it. Now, measuring is one thing, but actually testing is another thing. Again, there are ways for us to test contrast ratios and so on. For example, in Windows, you can enter the settings, and there you will find high contrast settings, and you can switch the default theme of Windows to a very high contrasting theme. For example, like this one, or this one. Or you can also set your own colors here. And I did that, and I made a very simple example. Okay, the contrast, okay, it's better now. A very simple example. It's based on something I found on Dribbble. It's something like a login form. And I used it in several high contrasting themes. And this is what it looks like. What you can see here is that the button isn't recognizable anymore. You see centered text, but you don't see that it is a button. And if it wasn't for the placeholder text, you wouldn't see the input fields. They would be invisible. A really quick fix for me was to add default borders for the input fields and the buttons, and now the accessibility is much, much better for this simple form in high contrast modes. Of course, that was only just a quick fix. There's a lot more to it. Annika Henke wrote a very awesome article about that, and I'm going to share it with my slides later on. Another great tool is called No Coffee. It's a browser plugin. There you can set several things. For example, you can make the site blurry, or you can simulate color deficiencies, or you can even simulate blocked visual fields. So there are a lot of things you can do in this settings panel here to test stuff. Again, it's called No Coffee. The reason why I'm talking about contrast, I guess you know the reason, but one of the reasons why I'm talking about contrast is there has been a certain trend of using low contrasting colors in web design. Something like, I don't know, gray on gray text color on light gray background. Now this might look nice, but it's very inaccessible. And I'm pretty sure that there are other colors than gray and light gray that look nice. Believe it or not, but people are still printing stuff out, and people are even printing websites. People are printing contact information, directions, recipes, articles, pretty much everything. And we should try to give them at least some kind of experience. And that's actually pretty easy. All you have to do is to define an add media block in your CSS, similar to media queries, and then change all the items you want to look differently on paper. For example, if you have a fixed header, you can set it to static on paper. Or you can also maybe hide the navigation, because it's probably pretty useless on paper. Who would have thought? Another thing you can do maybe is to, by default, hide everything or every direct child item of the body except for the main content, so hiding the header and the footer. And one thing that's pretty cool about the print medium is that we can use absolute units like centimeter or millimeter, and point just makes sense. You shouldn't use that on a web, but on paper it makes absolutely sense. Something that's special about print is that links are unfortunately useless. You can't click them, you can try, but it wouldn't work. But there is a thing we can do to make them at least, to put at least some use in links on paper. And it's this selector here. We can select all links that start with HTTP. This includes HTTPS as well, but it doesn't include relative paths or anchor links. And then we make sure that we don't include absolute links to our site. And then we use the after pseudo element to add the content of the href attribute in parentheses right next to the text. So this paragraph here will look like this on screen, and on paper it will look like this. So the value of the href attribute is printed next to the word. It's not perfect, but it's something. If you are like me, you like to use the keyboard sometimes for navigation on a website. For example, if you're filling out a long form, because it's easier to jump from one form item to another if you use the keyboard, the tab key. Sometimes that works great, and sometimes that doesn't work at all, because we as developers are pretty good at doing bad things to form items. We are. Let me show you some of those things. Here we have two buttons. When I click the first button, an alert pops up. Great. If I click the second button, the alert pops up as well. And now I'm going to use the tab key to focus those buttons. I can focus the first one, but I can't focus the second one. The reason for that is that the first button is an HTML5 button element. The second button is a div that looks like a button. And divs aren't focusable. Of course, you can add the tab index attribute and make it focusable. But if you are already using the keyboard, you would probably want to do everything with the keyboard, also triggering this event by clicking space or enter. And you can only do that on the button, because we get those key events for free with the button element. And that just doesn't work on the div. Of course, you can add those events manually, but why would you if you just could use button? So please use button if you need a button. Another bad thing is here. We have a nice looking form, and now you are going to see which keys I'm pressing right next to the form. Did you see that? No, you didn't, because that's in my CSS. I'm selecting all items in this page in their focus state, and I'm setting the outline to none. But just using those 3 lines, I'm excluding a whole group of people from being able to use my site. If I remove those 3 lines, you will see this. Now all of a sudden we can see where we are in the form, because we get this nice blurry blue line, outline. Now, the reason why designers and developers remove this blue outline in the first place is it's just ugly, it just doesn't look nice. And on top of that, it's very inconsistent across browsers. So for example, here on Chrome, you will get this blue outline. On Firefox, you will get a dotted outline. And on Android, for example, a solid orange outline. So it kind of makes sense to remove it. But if you do, provide at least some kind of alternative styling. You can use your brand colors and use solid borders, background color, link color, text color, whatever it is, just some kind of focus styles. And again, you can do that by using the focus pseudo class. Or you can use some of the newer stuff. For example, here, this form only displays the border if one of its children has focus. So it's not the form itself that is focus, but one of its child items. And that's possible using the focus within pseudo class. It's pretty new. Support is okay-ish. But you can use it now if you are not using it for anything too critical, I guess. One thing that's annoying about focus styles is that sometimes they are displayed when you don't want them to be displayed. For example, if you're using the mouse. So here, for example, we have a custom tab component, and you can see the outline when I'm using the keyboard. But now I'm going to click the tabs or the panels, and it's still visible. And this is not just annoying, but also can be very distracting to mouse users. So what we need is a way to differentiate between keyboard and mouse users. And that's possible using the focus ring pseudo class. Focus ring pretty much does the same thing as focus, but it only applies those styles when it makes sense. And the browser decides when it makes sense, so we don't have to do much more. Unfortunately, it only works in Firefox right now, but there is a very lightweight polyfill that you can use. Check it out, try it, and maybe also give feedback to the people who made it. So who are we making this for? Who are we making focus styles for? Of course, for us, the power users who like to use the keyboard on long forms, but especially for people who actually rely on the keyboard as their only way of navigation. For example, a person with just one arm. Or maybe someone who would actually use the mouse but can't because he or she broke their arm. Or maybe also a new parent who's holding a baby and has to check something out online. So it's important for us to know that there are permanent, temporary, and situational impairments. And this makes the group of potential keyboard users, for example, much, much bigger. I took the graphics of the Inclusive Design Guide by Microsoft. It's pretty cool. Check it out. All right, now I'm going to talk about some of the newer stuff here, about grid. We have a list of images here, and I want to lay them out in a nice looking grid. That's pretty easy with CSS grid layouts. I just set the display to grid. I define as many columns as fit the screen with a minimum width of 180 pixels. I add some spacing, vertical and horizontal spacing, and I set a default height for all rows in this grid. So 4 lines of CSS, and we get this. Pretty awesome, and it's of course also completely responsive. So that's nice. By the way, the images are scaled so nicely because I'm using object fit. Sarah mentioned that in her talk. But the only thing that's not right here is that we lost the different image sizes. We had big and long images. We can fix that. I'm going to select all the long and the large images, and I'm going to make them span 2 rows. And then I'm selecting the large images and make them span 2 columns. And I'm going to place the first one at the very end of our grid and the last one at the very beginning to make it look a little nicer. And this is what we get. Due to the implicit placement I did and the different image sizes, we get those gaps. We can try to work around that. There is a property called grid autoflow, and if you set the value to dense, the browser will try to fill those gaps. And this is what we get. 6 lines of CSS, and of course also completely responsive. This is super, super, super awesome, and it sucks. Let's see what happens if you try to use the keyboard on this gallery. So the first image is focused now, and I'm pressing tab. Okay, it says, where are we going? Okay, that's all right. Which one is, okay, this one. So since the browser reordered the items, the visual order isn't anymore the same order as the DOM order, and that's bad for keyboard users because there's no way of knowing which item is going to be focused next. Don't get me wrong, please use Grid and use everything Grid has to offer. It's really, really awesome, but just be careful when you're using it on very interactive, interaction-sensitive stuff like forms. No, don't use it on forms, but on galleries or stuff like that. This, of course, doesn't just apply to Grid, but to pretty much any property that affects order in some way, like flexbox, position, float, negative margins, and so on. All right. Okay, since we are at the topic of Grid, who of you has already used Grid? Okay, some people. Who used it in production? Okay, you're cool, you're cool. Do it, it's awesome. All major browser, desktop browsers support it, even Edge since a week, or a few days. So all major desktop browsers support it. Of course, there's still IE 10 and 11 and older Edge, but you can still use it thanks to the power of progressive enhancement. You can provide a very basic version of your site, for example, using floats, and then enhance it with Grid. Let me show you a demo to illustrate what I mean by that. Here we have a very simple single column layout. It doesn't look nice because it's on a large screen, but that's pretty much what you would get on a smartphone. That's not very nice, but it's all right. I can enhance that by using float, and now we have a layout. It's boring, but it works. We can enhance it some more using flexbox. And now especially the lower part gets a little more interesting, so that's pretty cool. And then we can enhance it some more and do whatever we want because Grid. And what's cool about that is that we don't have to write 3 or 4 different versions of our site. We just provide this basic layout using float, and then we put Grid on top of that. Because properties like display inline block, display table cell, column properties, float don't work on flex or grid items. They just don't have any effect. So you don't have to overwrite them for browsers that support Grid. They just simply don't do anything anymore if they're applied to a grid or flex item. The only time where you probably have to use feature queries is when you override widths or margins, something like that. So that's pretty cool. And Grid is cool, but it also introduces a new temptation. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say we want to build something like that. We have a heading and 6 items here, and the HTML may look like this. So we have a div and a heading, an unordered list, and those 6 items. I'm going to use display grid here again. I'm going to create those 3 columns. I'm setting a gap again, and I'm placing the heading. And this is what we get, of course, because only direct child items of a grid container are laid out in a grid. And the direct child items are the H2 and the unordered list. The worst thing you can do is to remove the unordered list and transform all the divs to all the list items to divs. You should not compromise on semantics for design or dev experience reasons. Don't do that, please. Please. What you could do is you could use display subgrids. If you apply it to the unordered list, the list items will behave as if they were direct child items of the div themselves. Unfortunately, display subgrid didn't make it into level 1 of the specification, but it will probably come with level 2. I don't know when, but we hope. Another thing you could do is to set a display to contents. Contents will make the list items behave as if their parent, the unordered list, didn't exist at all. So they would behave as if they were direct child items of the grid container. Yeah, no. Firefox, again, is the only browser that supports that. So what you ultimately have to do is to define another grid in this unordered list. So again, display grids, 3 columns, and gap. I know that's not cool, but it's something. Since the unordered list has the same width as the container, you can make it span all 3 columns and just inherit all the properties. So you can inherit all the display properties. It's a little nicer, yeah. Whatever it is you do, don't flatten the structure. Don't do that. Of course, that's not everything you have to know about CSS and accessibility, but it's also more than just a starting point. Let's say you take 2 of the things I showed you today and care about them in your next project, you are already doing a really great job. And if you take 2 more things and apply them in your next project, you are working towards a better, more inclusive and more open web. It's important that we as designers and developers don't just design and make websites for the way we are using it. We must not assume that our users are using a certain operating system, input device, browser, or device. And as my mentor Aaron Gustafson said, designing with constraints in mind is simply designing well. I know that was a lot, but there is a written form of this article online on Medium, of this talk online on Medium, and I can recommend a very awesome book by Hayden Pickering. It's called Inclusive Design Patterns. I even have it with me, so if you want to take a look, feel free to meet me afterwards. Again, the slides are online. Thank you very much.